Hello, I'm Jordan Cuff. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Newcastle University. My research focuses on ecological interactions between different invertebrates, mostly looking at what they eat in the wild using molecular techniques like DNA metabarcoding. But I'm going to talk to you today about my work with biobanking charity Frozen Ark, and particularly what they're doing, how they do it, and why they do it around cryopreservation in the name of conservation. So you'll all be fully aware that the 21st century isn't looking good. There are many challenges facing the invertebrate biodiversity of our planet, from climate change through hunting, land use changes, urban development, rising sea levels, natural disasters, you name it. We think we have it bad in the 21st century. Boy, do the insects have it bad. And in Europe, they comprise many of the most threatened species. So we're constantly on the lookout for ways to save them from the brink. And it's not just the beautiful physical invertebrates that we lose when they go extinct. It's also all the material that they contain inside them, so their genomes and their DNA, which itself provides a really valuable resource in the fight to save them. By having samples of DNA from different invertebrates and other animals, we can basically plan how best to protect them, looking at things like inbreeding and population crashes that might result from that, but also looking at different ways of monitoring and detecting them in the wild. And that's kind of where Frozen Ark comes in. So when you think of arks, you might be thinking Noah's Ark from biblical times. Well, Frozen Ark is basically the 21st century equivalent. So it's the idea of collecting all these samples of DNA and tissue and all sorts else, and storing them and cryopreserving them, so freezing them for use for conservation researchers and scientists to help save these species going forward. So the main mission of Frozen Ark is to advance the use of cryopreservation for safeguarding genetic material of endangered species. The short version is freeze stuff to keep it safe. So the main angle of that is cryopreservation, which is basically preserving things by freezing them, and so basically protecting the DNA and tissues and other materials from endangered species, but also collecting more samples, expanding the number of different species that this collection comprises. But another really important angle of Frozen Ark is outreach. So teaching people the importance of cryopreservation as a means for protecting our species, but also the dangers that many species face generally, and also training the next generation of cryopreservation scientists and actually carrying out active research along those lines as well. You might be immediately thinking about dinosaurs. Apparently quite a few people do when we talk about Frozen Ark. Just to set the record straight, Frozen Ark isn't Jurassic Park. They do end in the same three letters, but Frozen Ark is by no means looking to resurrect the dinosaurs from samples of DNA taken from amber. This is called the Lazarus approach, and it's been spoken about a lot in the context of the thylacine, which is the animal you can see on the right-hand side there. A really beautiful animal that's thought to be extinct in the wild, and there was a lot of discussion a while ago about using this Lazarus approach, which is basically using genetic material to try and bring it back from extinction. But Frozen Ark is really very much focused on the here and now, the species that we can still save from extinction. But I think it's important to set that record straight. There are a lot of ethical and technical dilemmas involved in bringing things back from extinction, which is, to be honest, all the more reason that we should be protecting them. You might be wondering how it all started, though. What is the origin story of Frozen Ark? So I'm going to give you a whirl through the history of Frozen Ark. It's a really terrible pun, I'm so sorry. Whirl refers to the spirals in a snail shell. Many of the malacologists out there might know. But I've sort of spoiled it for you a bit there. It all started with snails. So here we have Professor Brian Clark and Dr. Anne Clark, who are both doing research on these snails you can see on the right hand side there, the partula snails, Polynesian tree snails. really beautiful, diverse group. But actually, whilst Brian and Anne Clark were researching these, they began to go through some extinctions and population crashes, which is all quite a complicated story. Effectively, on these islands where the partula snails are found, they brought in these giant African land snails, Achatina species. These are really beautiful, large things. You probably have seen some pet ones at some point in your life, but apparently they're also really nice food sources. But anyway, they were imported onto this island, and they didn't behave themselves. They began eating all the crops and all of the other plants and just decimating the local flora. So there was clearly a problem to be solved there. So you'll have heard the old nursery rhyme or story about the lady who swallows a fly and then swallows a spider and then ends up basically eating everything. This is a similar story in some ways, because they thought they'd solve the problem of these introduced land snails by introducing yet another land snail, the rosy wolf snail, Euglandina rosea. So this rosy wolf snail was meant to be a predator of the giant African land snails and eat them all, but alas, it didn't. Instead, it ate these Polynesian tree snails, the partula snails, which we were just looking at a second ago. So pretty disastrous for them. They're just minding their own business, and then a new predator comes onto the scene and starts eating them all. But luckily, because they were having research carried out on them and their populations at the time, there were samples being collected, and they could be cryopreserved, and that really informed the conservation plans going forward. And actually, captive populations were established in London Zoo and Bristol Zoo. In fact, if you go to Bristol Zoo, you can still see them there today in the wonderful invertebrate area. But from these populations, they managed to get viable numbers for reintroduction plans and all sorts. So a happy story that all sort of comes back to cryopreservation. But nowadays, Frozen Ark is even more invertebrate focused than ever before. Over the last few years, there's been a lot of work on vertebrates, but I think with increasing knowledge around the invertebrate biodiversity declines, Frozen Ark has really stepped up its game on the invertebrate front. So you'll be seeing more of that in this talk, but also hopefully going forward in years to come. So this is the actual physical aspect of Frozen Ark. So they have a HQ in headquarters in Nottingham, attached to the university. So you can see the nice doors with the leaves in front of them there on the left. Nice office space. But the main physical element, Frozen Ark, probably doesn't take 100 guesses. It's loads of freezers. So you can see in the middle there a -80 freezer, really important for cryopreserving things. -20 freezers, like the ones you have at home, don't tend to cut it. It's not quite cold enough. It slows down degradation, but doesn't completely arrest it. So keeping samples in these -80 freezers, which are whopping beasts, but also these liquid nitrogen tanks is really important. And that's where most of them are kept. And you might be wondering, what are those samples? Some of them are blood, mostly from vertebrates. I don't know if they have any hemolymph from invertebrates, but if they do, I'll be sure to look for that. DNA as well is the obvious one. We've spoken about that a lot. But also tissues that DNA could be extracting from. And then also gametes, so sperm and eggs that could be used for raising the next population of whatever animal we're talking about. But it's not just in Nottingham that Frozen Ark can be found. Cardiff is actually one of its main hubs, so it's really Nottingham and Cardiff that sort of run the show. But you can see quite a few names there. Frozen Ark's actually spread across 5 continents and has partnerships from research companies, zoos, museums, universities. So an awful lot of freezer space the world over. Really what Frozen Ark does is operates a sort of a federation model of organizations. So all of these different places are working together to make sure that these tissue samples and DNA samples and whatnot are all completely accessible, available, and very well kept. Just to kind of draw on two specific collaborations, one of them, Darwin Tree of Life, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. In fact, I'm sure it will come up during the conference. But effectively, it's a scheme in the UK aiming to sequence the genomes of all of the animals that we have. Quite an ambitious project. It's started out sort of collecting some of the rarer things and a few of the common things. But it's really looking to ramp up and expand from there. But Frozen Ark's been involved in preserving many of those samples, particularly in Nottingham and Cardiff, and keeping them safe whilst they await their journey to sequencing heaven. But there's also a big push by Frozen Ark to contribute samples to Darwin Tree of Life. So there have been a few different events organised by Frozen Ark, such as a BioBlitz in Cardiff last year, which collected materials that should be contributing. And I believe there are plans for a few expeditions to some picturesque areas full of beautiful invertebrates. So more on that at some point soon, hopefully. And then CryoArks is another very close collaborator, Frozen Ark. So CryoArks is a UK-based sort of counterpart to Frozen Arks in many ways. But they focus on not just endangered species, but basically all animals. So that includes livestock and all sorts else. But the infrastructure of Frozen Ark is actually very much shared with CryoArks, and also the European and Middle East zoos and aquatic animals biobank. So by bringing these different organizations together, it's possible to have these centralized databases that are really accessible and easy for people to use. And you can find on CryoArks many of the Frozen Ark samples actually catalogued already. A recent project of Frozen Arks is the Cool Bugs UK one. Not just bugs, all invertebrates, I believe. But this is a fundraiser. The Aviva Climate Fund offered to match fund any crowd funds gathered. So this is basically to raise money to begin collecting and cryopreserving more invertebrate samples in the UK to try and expand representation of particularly endangered species in these biobanks. You might have come across it at some point, but hopefully you'll see some really cool stuff coming out from that. And I mentioned toward the start that outreach is a big part of Frozen Ark's work, and so coming back to this image of the world in catastrophe and the Frozen Ark saving all the DNA, these are the two kind of topics that the outreach activities tend to cover. So teaching people about the biodiversity crisis and just how bad it might get if we don't step up and solve the crisis in whatever way we can, but also how cryopreservation and biobanking can actually be a part of that solution. So this has involved all sorts of physical and online events. So you might have seen Frozen Ark at something or other over the last year or two, particularly. There have been loads of events in Cardiff, but also on Twitter and social media. So you can see the Frozen Ark Twitter there, very much worth a follow. So particularly whilst the Cool Bugs UK crowdfunding was coming together, there were loads of really great sort of posts about information on different invertebrates. So you can see a few nice information packets there about the tansy beetle, which is a particularly magnificent beetle. So definitely check out the Twitter. But one of the most ambitious outreach programs of Frozen Ark in the last few years is the Arks of the 21st Century one. So this is a Wellcome Trust funded outreach program using the ISSF3 funding stream in Cardiff. And basically involved going to a whole myriad of different events. So you can see National Museum Wales is there. We did a stall at Super Science Saturday. I'll run you through some of the stuff we did with that in a second. Cardiff Science Festival as well, which is well worth a go if you're around when it's next on. And then Green Man 2021. So Green Man Festival has this thing called Einstein's Garden, which is literally just science engagement. You can see Sam and Max dressed as an elephant and a spider, respectively, there. We did all sorts of crazy events at all these different things. And just to sort of draw attention to a few of the activities, you can see this is the Cardiff Science Festival one. So on the left, you can see a little tilt maze, and that was teaching people about all the different sample types that go to different biobanks and sort of navigating the perils of getting those samples to the right biobank. But we also had in the middle there a DNA extraction that people could do themselves. So extracting DNA from a strawberry with salt and detergent, which you can do in your home straight after this if you're feeling really excited about strawberry DNA. It's actually really good fun if you've not done a DNA extraction before. And then over there in the other side, on the right hand side, we have a ball pit game, which is about sort of rescuing endangered species. But we have a sort of central hub for all of these different outreach aspects called the virtual booth. And it's definitely an experience. So go to the Frozen Ark website if you want to check out all of these different things displayed in an interactive format. It's frozenark.org. And one of the most profound of these different online sort of events is the virtual Ark. So this was kind of the culmination of the Arks of the 21st Century Outreach Project. It's an experience like no other. It's on YouTube and hosted on the Frozen Ark website. But it was all in collaboration with the artist Paul Evans, visual artist from Sheffield, also the poet Rowena Somerville, who's done some incredible poetry about invertebrates in the past. You might know the silverfish rap. That seems to be the one that many people recognize. But effectively, the idea was to try and create a visualization of what people might envisage of the Ark of the 21st century. So effectively, visual representation of a biobank in many ways. But you can see all these strange plasticine creations. They were created by people at these outreach events. So it really is an adventure. And it even includes the parchula snails and a few different facts about them, and even a poem. So that's well worth a look. There's also a podcast that Frozen Ark runs called Frozen Bites. So this has covered all sorts of different topics so far. There was one on coral preservation, and there's another one on invertebrate conservation. The coral one actually covers some research underway in collaboration with Frozen Ark. The invertebrate conservation one is largely about the invertebrate biodiversity crisis, and features me basically blabbering away a lot like you've seen for the last 18 minutes. But very much worth a listen if you're looking for something new to listen to. Another really important aspect of Frozen Ark's work is training the next generation of cryopreservation scientists. So if you know anyone, particularly who's looking for a placement year in their degree, Frozen Ark is a great place to do that. So there are sort of outreach events to get involved in. Also actual science projects that feed into the sort of research of Frozen Ark. So a few years ago, for example, there were some projects looking at freeze thawing and its effect on cryopreservation and the integrity of the DNA therein. But there are also experiences as part of that, such as presenting at conferences. So Wales Ecology and Evolution Network is a conference run for students in Wales every year. And for the last few years, at least, the Frozen Ark students have presented there, which has been really successful, actually. But the take-home messages from all of this really are that cryopreservation is a really critical part of conservation in the 21st century. Hopefully you'll be fairly convinced of that from this. But also that existing biodiversity collections are an untapped resource for genomic information for conservation. So many of the collections in Frozen Ark are actually from previous sort of museum collections and such. So something to really begin to use more. And hopefully you'll see from the happy faces in the photos of the outreach events that the public's pretty receptive to the idea of biobanking. There's a lot of fun to be had in those discussions. If you're wondering how you can help, there's a Frozen Ark as a charity depends on donations, so there's a link there, frozenark.org/donate. Any donations go a long way in helping support the cryopreservation, the research, the outreach, and everything else that we've discussed today. But if you're not really into donations and you want something back for it, Frozen Ark even sells T-shirts. So there you go. There's something for everyone. There aren't any invertebrates on the T-shirt, but I'm sure you can put one on with a Sharpie if you're so inclined. I personally am. But there we go. Thanks very much for listening, and if you have any questions, please do get in touch, and hopefully you'll go and cryopreserve everything you see.